We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. The French election is extremely close as President Macron's coalition is working with a razor-thin lead. Also, the disastrous political and economic environment in the U.S. are causing many Democrats to second-guess President Biden's announcement that he will seek re-election in 2024. Joining us to discuss this matter, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher, and his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Emmanuel Macron's centrist grouping was neck and neck with a new left-wing alliance led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon in the vote share of the first round of parliamentary elections. You had some pretty good predictions for this. What do you think about the results so far of the French election, Dr. Horne?
Well, so far, I would have to say, a la Mr. Mélenchon, that it has been a gigantic step forward for the left. Recall that Mélenchon knocked together a coalition of socialists, communists, and Greens, and his own party, France Unbowed. In fact, if they had been able to unite before the presidential elections, we might be speaking of a President Mélenchon right now. There is a second round of the elections, as you know, taking place on about 6 days from now. And it is possible that the slogan of that left-wing coalition, Mélenchon as prime minister, will be effectuated. All they need is a majority in the parliament, and then Mr. Macron will have few alternatives except to appoint Mélenchon as his prime minister in this French novelty of so-called cohabitation. Even if Mr. Mélenchon does not become prime minister, I think that this election sends a loud signal, the signal being not only dissatisfaction with the domestic policies of Mr. Macron, but it may also have implications for foreign policy. Note that as of Thursday of this week, Mr. Macron, Chancellor Scholz, and Prime Minister Mario Draghi of Italy will be traveling to Ukraine together. It's unclear what their agenda will be, but you only need to scan the headline and read about the rather dispiriting performance of the Ukrainian forces on the battlefield to get an idea of what may be on the agenda. Or you can look at the interview with Henry Kissinger in this past weekend's London Times, where he invokes a slogan that we thought was peculiar to historic Palestine, i.e. land for peace. That is to say that Kiev should seriously consider either acceding to certain land cessions, such as Crimea, such as the Donbass, perhaps other regions, and then sue for peace. Whatever the case, obviously the prognosis for Ukraine going forward is rather grim, and I think that the French elections will not be greeted warmly in Ukraine nor in its right-wing allies, speaking of Poland and the Baltic republics, who have been pushing the French-German-Italy alliance to turn more to the right, like Warsaw has. That has not been going very well. But there's still a battle to be waged because Germany, on the one hand, is in a formal relationship with France. They're the locomotive of the European Union. But Germany, to put it euphemistically, is deeply influenced by the hawks in Washington. And so there's a kind of tug and war for the heart and soul of Berlin, with Paris being on one side and Washington on the other, although, as we've said many times on this program, is not as if Paris is wholly innocent insofar as they recognize that U.S. imperialism is the global guarantor for world imperialism, particularly French imperialism and its neo-empire in Africa, where France is heavily dependent upon U.S. satellite imagery, not to mention Africa, the mailed fist of the Pentagon in the heart of Africa. So there's much to be sorted out with regard to these French elections, but we can say this, that it has not been greeted with happiness in the intimate circle of Mr. Macron, although he should think again, because this left-wing surge may help to save his tottering administration, help to rescue France from digging a deeper hole for itself in Ukraine.
Does the left-wing surge have less impact because they say that the turnout Sunday hit a record low of 47%, and so the mood being described there is angry and disillusioned? That's one part of the question. The second part of the question is, does a Mélenchon victory, thereby representing a victory on the left, does that give Olaf Scholz cover or strength in helping him decide to go against United States interests? And third part of the question, you touched on this with the right wing, but does a defeat of Le Pen send a real big message to these ultra-right nationalists that their movements are losing steam?
Well, with regard to the latter point, I think it's premature to give last rites to the ultra-right-wing nationalists. I think that there's too significant and substantial a material base for their ascension, not least the oxygen that they receive from the superpower on the west bank of the Atlantic, speaking of the United States of America, whereas we just know we've been made aware of the plan to have a coup d'etat of these right-wing forces on January 6, 2021. And what's alarming about that is that there's not more alarm. And that tends to suggest to me that this right-wing ultra-nationalist surge in the United States will continue to proliferate and therefore will be reaching across the Atlantic, not only to their allies in Kiev and Warsaw and the Baltics, but also in France. With regard to Mr. Scholz, it's hard to puzzle out what this will mean. On the one hand, as noted, there is this marriage between France and Germany. It's a locomotive, as noted, of the European Union. But Mr. Scholz is a social democrat. His foreign minister is a Green. That has not seemed to have slowed down their hawkish rhetoric with regard to Ukraine. We can only hope that the defeats on the battlefield will help to inject a note of realism. And I think you're going to have to refresh my recollection with regard to question number one.
I think question number one had to do with the outcome of the low turnout in France. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, yes. I mean, but I think that Mr. Macron might be worried about that because it was expected that his supporters would be storming to the polls to stop this left-wing scourge. The fact that there was a low turnout seems to suggest that his supporters are not necessarily enthusiastic. And that bodes well, it seems to me, for the left. I should also say that the left in France, as you might expect, is heavily dependent upon voters of French nationals of Arab and African extraction. That also sends a message because it suggests that French foreign policy with regard to their homelands, speaking of Algeria, speaking of Senegal, speaking of Benin, etc., will have to, shall we say, adjusted going forward. And that does not necessarily bode well for the hawkishness that inheres in French imperialism.
The New York Times reports many Democratic lawmakers and party officials are venting their frustrations with President Biden's struggle to advance the bulk of his agenda, doubting his ability to rescue the party from a predicted midterm trouncing, and increasingly viewing him as an anchor that should be cut loose in 2024. Things are looking bleak for the Biden team. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, yes, and I happened to see the interview with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on CNN yesterday, where she refused point blank to give a full-throated endorsement to Mr. Biden's reelection chances. I also have seen the headlines that suggest that for whatever reason, Kamala Harris, the vice president, is having fundraising soirees in South Carolina. I've also seen the headlines touting a possible candidacy of Governor Gavin Newsom of the state of California. And I also took note of these rather pointed references to Mr. Biden's age, that if he were to serve a second term, he would be closer to 90 at the end of that second term than he would be to 80, the number which now he is closest to of all. So I think that Mr. Biden may want to reconsider running for re-election. He may want to revive the idea that he himself floated, that he was a bridge between generations. And he may want to decide that the Democratic Party needs a fresh start with a new and invigorated and perhaps even younger leadership.
So who, in your eyes, if they choose the latter, it becomes the kingmaker? Because I'm looking at it here in Maryland, for example, the governor's race, and Tom Perez is using former President Obama in his ads. In fact, Obama's voice does the voiceover of the entire ad. You have Glenn Ivey running for Congress, and he is showing photographs of himself with Obama in his campaign. So who becomes the kingmaker in the Democratic Party? Does Joe Biden put his shaky hand on Kamala Harris? Does Barack Obama put his hand, or do the Clintons decide who the next Democratic nominee is going to be, or none of the above?
It may be none of the above. We've yet to get a decisive signal from the labor movement, a bulwark of the Democratic Party. And we've yet to hear a decisive signal from elements within the Congressional Black Caucus. But I would urge and encourage the Democratic Party and its constituent members and components to engage in an agonizing reappraisal, to reevaluate how Mr. Biden was sunk in a quagmire in Ukraine, which then led to escalating gasoline prices, inflation, and all the rest, which wounded him severely. An agonizing reappraisal about the scattershot, helter-skelter retreat from Afghanistan in August 2021, which in many ways was the beginning of the end for any idea of an invigorated Biden presidency. The Democratic Party really needs not only a spring cleaning, but a summer cleaning, a fall cleaning, and a winter cleaning too.
I think you're right. And the other thing is, Biden, to me, I would say this: he's a symptom of the problem in that they've handed the steering wheel over to the Liz Cheneys and the George W. Bushes and the Bill Kristols of the world, and their foreign policy is run by these crazy neocons. And once you do that, you're heading for the exit. 1 minute.
Well, and I think, as I've said before, there's a structural problem, which is that the Democratic Party is heavily dependent upon black votes in a settler colonial regime based on white supremacy and enslavement of Africans. That means that they're suspect amongst a goodly number of Euro-Americans in terms of steering this ship of state in choppy waters, particularly concerning foreign policy. So therefore, the leadership has to bend over backwards to show that they're worthy of leadership on foreign policy, which leads to these disasters in Ukraine. Under President Johnson, it led to a disaster in Indochina. Under President Truman, it led to a disaster on the Korean Peninsula. So that's one of the major issues the Democratic Party really needs to sort out sooner rather than later.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author and a historian and a researcher, and his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio.